With the current population of over 1.3 billion and still rising, China faces the challenges not only presented by the largest population in the world, but also by the biggest demographic shift ever exhibited in human history. Annually, the number of Chinese citizens that move from rural towns to urban city centers is equivalent to half of the population of France, 30 million people every year. This shift in the population has created 160 metropolitan centers the size of Dallas, Texas, and puts pressure on the local and national government to provide for their citizens. To get a sense of these effects on modern China, I was able to meet with urban planners, designers, policymakers, entrepreneurs, and everyday people in Shanghai, Beijing, Duzhangyan, and Hong Kong before returning home. I was also able to sample some of the awesome local food. The first characteristic I noticed about Shanghai was the abundance of tall buildings with unique architecture, such as the Oriental Pearl Tower and the Shanghai World Financial Center. While these impressive buildings captured my attention as I toured the city, they also represent the current trend in modern Chinese construction. Many city centers, like Shanghai, are running out of room to continue developing outwards, and are now forced to build upwards to utilize their space most efficiently. The issue with constructing these buildings is many times they replace old historic sites, which represent the cultural identity of each city. If historical sites are not replaced by new land-efficient buildings, they must be constantly maintained and refurbished to continue to function in their modern environment. The district where the first Congress of the Chinese Communist Party met in Shanghai has been preserved despite the construction of massive apartment complexes all around it. Most of the one-story buildings have been cleaned up and converted into restaurants and bars to provide a service for the city beyond their historical value. When touring the city, the cheapest and most convenient form of transportation is Shanghai's extensive public transportation system. Many Chinese citizens do not own a car due to the high living costs and rely on public transportation to travel around the city. In the past, the Chinese envied the US because the average American was able to own a car, but as the standard of living has risen across the country, more cars are joining the morning commute every month. To combat increased traffic, cities have reduced the amount of licenses distributed and use a lottery system to choose who will receive the license. Increased individual ownership of cars also puts higher environmental stress on the country, and private organizations such as the China's Sustainable Transportation Center are working on projects to increase the use of green transportation, such as citywide bike shares, similar to the one implemented in DC. Shanghai not only boasts a heavily used local transportation system, but also an intercity train network that allows passengers to travel between cities in a short period of time. A demonstration magnetic levitation train, or maglev for short, connects the main airport to the city center. Sandy and I also took the high-speed train from Shanghai to Beijing, traveling at 150 miles per hour over 5 hours. Despite the speed and convenience, Chinese Rail has had several safety issues with their trains, as one crashed within days of our trip to Beijing. Speeds have been temporarily reduced, but these remain an important part of the national transportation network. Currently, the Chinese and American economies are tied together due to the large investments we have made in each other's countries, but despite common belief, one nation does not have economic power over another. If either country took its investment back, then both economies would be damaged because the countries are so financially intertwined. As China has developed, the price of labor in the cities has risen considerably, and many companies are moving away from the coast and further into the interior, repeating and expanding the urbanization process. The higher Chinese costs are also pushing the country to move beyond the manufacturing end of the production cycle and towards a more high-tech oriented economy in which China creates the ideas for products instead of manufacturing them. China is also seeking to shift away from being export-driven and move towards being self-sustainable and focused on domestic demand. To slow the influx of migrant workers pursuing higher-paying jobs in megacities, the Chinese government instituted a policy called hukou, in which the residents only receive welfare and public services in the city or town to which they claim citizenship. Immigrants are not allowed education and medical care services if they are not citizens of the city in which they work. China has grown so quickly that regulations have not been able to be fully coordinated between government ministries. As I learned from a coffee entrepreneur, the Import and Export Bureau requires a public drain to be in their coffee factory, whereas the Health Bureau insists that there be no public drains in the coffee-making process for fear of food contamination from sewage. So he came up with a removable drain. When the Import and Export Bureau inspectors visit, he connects the drain to the sink via a long hose, and they check it off the list of requirements. When the Health Bureau inspectors visit, he disconnects the hose, and they check it off their list as well. Problem solved. When touring the city of Beijing in the evening, I encountered this sunset, which made me take a second look at the sun, which was still relatively high in the sky. But there was so much pollution in the sky from cars, factories, and coal plants that I could look at it without hurting my eyes. China gets nearly 80% of its electric power from coal plants, making it the largest coal consumer in the world. They are trying to replace those coal plants with nuclear and other sources, but the rates of growth remain so high that the overall transition to coal remains very slow overall. And in another instance, this small river was choked with algae because of the large amounts of CO2 in the air.
Where I wanted to home, where I wanted to home, where I wanted to
Despite the fact that China's population is growing, the country's populace is aging and the workforce is growing smaller. The one-child policy has both lowered the population of the young generation and created a gender imbalance. The male-to-female ratio has grown larger, thus making it harder for men to find a wife and start a family. With less successful families, the working population begins to plateau, which is now happening today. Over the past decade, there has been a gradual change in the Chinese family structure. Decades ago, traditional big extended family structures were shaken because the transition to socialism meant the loss of property rights in the old days. The role of a male head of the family thus became less important. The younger generation no longer had to follow the older generation, as the government allocated the products and earnings to everyone instead of the heads of families. In today's society, the Chinese family is much more separated and independent of each other. As well as a changing family dynamic, housing for migrant workers has evolved over time. Migrant workers used to live in the old houses owned by local farmers outside of a metropolitan area, but as the country develops, the old houses are demolished for larger, more expensive apartment complexes to be built. Due to the powerful government, China has had few slum problems, but migrant workers are forced into high rises as their old houses are demolished to make room for urban development.
Chance that you get is a chance.
Hong Kong has long been the historical financial center for China, as it has financed commerce traversing her ports and the manufacturing facilities in the area. But increasingly, foreign investment is financing infrastructure projects and companies themselves across the mainland.
All those places I got found.
Hong Kong has also been the home to some of the world's most renowned airport, city, and skyscraper designers and planners. Planning and design for large airports and renovations of entire city sections, in fact, sometimes the creation of entire new cities themselves, takes expertise in people movement simulation, earthquake and wind loading, multimodal planning, economic impact assessments, and sustainability. I was also able to see the plans on the boards for low-carbon communities, major new airport terminals spanning miles, and whole new cities spanning over 2,000 square kilometers. Let me thank the KS Wu Fellowship Committee and the many people who generously gave their time and perspectives on the urbanization challenges China is facing and overcoming. I hope you have enjoyed this look into an important part of our modern world.